A Yahoo exclusive Harris poll has found that more than half of millennials have seen their savings shrink due to the pandemic. We're joined now by Shai Akabas, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So, Shai, let's look at this Harris poll. 52% of millennials are saying that they've been financially impacted by this pandemic. And when I heard this, I thought of the fact that millennials were also badly impacted during the Great Recession. So, just one hit after another. I'm wondering what kind of knock on effects you're seeing financially to this generation specifically of not one, but now two really big financial shocks. Is this generation going to be much worse off than others?
It's really concerning, Kristin, and this is new research from the Funding Our Future campaign in partnership with Daily Pay and the Center for Financial Security. And for me, it really elevates two concerns about things that we already knew, which are relevant to millennials, but are more broadly systemic to the population. First, the effects of this pandemic have been highly uneven. When we look at higher income millennials, a quarter of them actually say that their savings have grown during the pandemic. But when you compare this to moderate income households, those under about $50,000, half of them say that they either have no savings at all or that those savings have been significantly depleted due to the pandemic. And then the second point here is that almost half of millennials say that they don't have enough savings to cover an emergency expense of $400. That's not very much. That level of financial insecurity is not what you'd expect from the greatest economic power in the world. And it should really be unacceptable to us that so many of our fellow Americans are living on the brink. So when you talk about the millennial generation, I do think that they face these outsized burdens because, yes, they have faced now a second shock in the course of 10 years. The first one was just as they were coming into the labor market. And now the second one is as they're getting started with their family formation, household purchases, all of that sort of thing.
Exactly. And to that point, the millennials obviously just reaching that labor market during the last financial shock, which caused them to already start their working life out with a lower salary if they were lucky enough to get a job. And now, as we're seeing here, now really struggling financially because of the coronavirus pandemic. So I'm wondering really long term here, an event that's going to be happening decades from now, which would be retirement. I'm wondering how these two events are really going to be impacting millennials going forward when it comes to their retirement. Because we're also seeing in this Harris poll that like 33% of millennials say that they're going to be working well into their 70s. We routinely heard millennials say that they don't think Social Security is going to be around for them. So I'm really wondering specifically how millennials are going to be impacted on this retirement piece, especially when you compare it to some of their other counterparts.
Yeah, it's striking because when you look at the other stats in the poll, about three-quarters of millennials have made either little or no progress on their retirement savings. The specific stat is that they've accumulated less than $10,000. Now, of course, they still have a lot of years left to make up that gap, but many of them don't have access to the types of vehicles like checking accounts, even, especially retirement savings accounts that you would need. About a third of people either don't have a third of millennials either don't have access to those accounts or aren't aware that they have access, which is another problem in terms of financial literacy and capability. So there's a lot of steps that need to happen, both from a public policy level, from a financial education level, from a business practices standpoint in terms of the benefits that we're providing people at the workplace in order to help get this generation prepared for retirement relative to where they are today.
Shai, you mentioned something a little bit earlier, which kind of hinted at what I want to talk about next, which is that there are differences even within this group. While we are seeing more than half are getting impacted financially, there are several that are actually able to save even more money during this pandemic. But I'm wondering, among those that are financially burdened, if there was a lot of differences or any differences in terms of impact, perhaps based on race or income level.
Yeah, that's a really concerning element of the data because when you look at it by race, for example, there are certainly elements that are more stark in communities of color. They have less savings, they have more debt, and they have less access to savings vehicles. And all of those compound. Student debt, for example, is one that has an outsized burden on the Black community. And the fact that we have no solution there is really problematic. Policymakers are now talking about whether it's debt forgiveness or I think a more practical solution is one that makes sure that nobody is paying more than an affordable portion of their income so that if you have no income, you don't make payments on your student loans. And then eventually, after a certain number of years, that gets entirely forgiven. So there are solutions that we can talk about that would help those communities. There's also the element of education here, where we see in the data that nearly 3 in 10 of those with only a high school education say they have no savings at all, compared to just 5% of those with a college degree or higher. That's not surprising because obviously more education leads to higher incomes and thus savings, but it shows that we're in a society that is becoming increasingly divergent among sort of the haves and the have-nots, or the have education and don't have education. We need to think about solutions that can help improve those trends.
So, speaking of solutions, I'm wondering if what you saw in this poll really underscores how badly stimulus is needed right now. Stimulus negotiations are, of course, stalled right now in Congress. And if you think that perhaps there's any economic policies that the new administration should really be considering or putting into place to either target this group or just Americans that really are struggling and are going to be seeing the knock on effects of, again, not just this crisis, but also a crisis from 10 years ago as they go forward in their lives.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that, because I think there is a short term component and a longer term challenge. The short term stress should be at least in part alleviated by action from Congress. And these current negotiations have taken too long. They've been doing this for about 6 months now, posturing, and they can't reach a deal. But millions of Americans, whether it's small business owners, the unemployed, the state and local governments, and the public sector workers that work for them, on and on and on. All of these people are waiting for relief, and they can't wait much longer because a lot of these benefits expire at the end of this year. So we need action there. But we also have to address these longer term challenges that were there even before this crisis, and that this economic downturn has just magnified. We can look at the income side and talk about tax credits for working families or the minimum wage. We can talk about the savings side and making sure that savings vehicles are available to workers and that they're effectively able to use them. We can talk about the debt side and solutions for the $1.5 trillion student loan challenge. There's a lot of pieces to it, but we need to start taking action early next year so that we can help households recover out of this tragic economic situation.
All right, Director of Economic Policy for the Bipartisan Policy Center, Shai Akabas, thanks so much for joining us today. For our Funding Our Future segment, Funding Our Future is an alliance of organizations dedicated to making a secure retirement possible for all Americans. Thanks so much for joining us today, Shai.
Thanks for having me, Kristin.